Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Hello, everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast, and welcome to part 3 of a series I'm doing called The Art of Depth Coaching. Right now, I only have 3 episodes in this series, and I'm going to keep it at that, but maybe in the future I'll record more, so stay tuned for that. You don't have to have listened to these episodes in order, but I do recommend you going back to part 2 and part 1 if you haven't had a chance, because I do offer a lot of really good insights in those episodes. Today, I want to talk about boundaries in work of your coaching, one-on-one work, which, can apply also to work in if you're a facilitator of like a group coaching program, but all of this is really grounded in one-on-one coaching. We're also going to be talking about trauma and how it may be showing up in your coaching work and what to do about it, how to navigate it. Obviously, I can only offer an overview. If you want to go in depth with all of these things that we've been talking about, that's where my mentorship comes in. So I'm doing this 3-part series in honor of my newest offering that I'm so thrilled to offer it in the world, Mentorship with Me, which is just another way of saying supervision for coaches. Mentorship is an opportunity for you either in group mastermind or on a one-on-one basis with me to deepen your coaching skills and your capacity to deal with the complexity of the human experience. I created this mentorship opportunity because I've seen how supervision has changed my life and my work, and how having a group support to guide me in seeing what I don't know and what I am missing, and our unconscious biases and how that may be playing out in the one-on-one work has been so profound in deepening my confidence as a coach. And that confidence has been everything. Back in 2015, when I decided to go into my business full-time, I believed that I had to do it by going into business coaching. And this wasn't a conscious decision, but more of an unconscious decision, really perpetuated by our industry. The coaching industry is very problematic in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that it is problematic is that it can often feel like a pyramid scheme where you coach coaches who coach coaches who coach coaches, and pretty much it's just coaches who are getting coaching support, right? So, I wanted to go into business full time. I thought the way to do that and to make money and to be successful was to do leadership coaching, business coaching, and that is what I shifted my business to. It was a very unsuccessful year for me. It felt very inauthentic, and I didn't understand why, but I just kept getting this message that like you're not really being you. And it was at the beginning of 2016 that I decided I had this like dark night of soul experience and realized, oh my God, like I don't want to be doing business coaching. I don't want to be talking about how other coaches can have this amazing lifestyle. I want to get to the real stuff like I had been doing and like I did in my work. But my marketing wasn't shaped in that way. So it didn't really feel authentic. So I dismantled my business for one of the many times I've dismantled my business and started again. And this time really focused on really good coaching. And from that point on, my business has flourished and grown, and it has felt so stable and steady and grounded and truthful and in integrity with what feels really real for me. When you focus on what is the most important part of a coaching business, which is your coaching work, everything tends to come together. The marketing feels easier because you know what you're marketing, because you have people that are right there telling you what they want from you. Marketing strategies come and go, right? Whether it's funnels or webinars. I mean, I've seen it all over the past 10 years. But coaching skills stick. Getting referrals, getting people, sharing your work because they loved your work, that stuff is priceless. And that's what I found to be true for me. Everything felt easier when I really focused on expanding my confidence in my coaching skills. And so that is what I'm offering in my mentorship. You can go to thaissky.com/mentorship. The way my mentorship works is that it's an ongoing basis. The group will be enrolling on an ongoing basis. So with a cap of 4 women. And so when it becomes full, I'll open a wait list, and then we'll be pulling from the wait list as the women end their time together and feel complete in our work together. Okay, so this will be always available, which is really exciting. I love the idea of finally being grounded in coaching coaches, not from a desire to, or not from a place of lack and feeling like it's the only way to succeed in business, but actually from a really like a place of a lot of knowledge that I'm really excited to share. Most of my coaching clients aren't coaches. I don't run a business that's for coaches. And that tells me that this work is needed outside the coaching world. We just have to make it accessible, and we have to make it trauma informed, and we have to make it responsible. And I have a feeling if you're listening to the podcast and you're a coach, this is the type of coach you are. You are a responsible coach, and all responsible coaches need to be in supervision. This needs to be a non-negotiable in our industry, just as it's a non-negotiable in other healing professions. In other healing professions, you are required to do thousands of hours of supervised work. And then after you're done with that, you're generally invited to continue to stay in a supervision group or a consultation group. Because like I said before, you don't know what we don't know. And keep staying together, like staying in a group, and it keeps us fresh. It keeps our work exciting. Like I talked about in part 2, it helps prevent burnout. It's just really good shit. So you can go to taysky.com/mentorship to learn more and apply. Okay, so let's start by talking about boundaries. The language that I use is a psychoanalytic language. It's a frame. I like to think of it as a frame because it helps to me to understand that like a really strong frame really helps the painting shine, right? It helps the painting really stand out. And so I like to think of it as like that like a frame, or like a window frame. Helps to keep the structure, the integrity of the work grounded. So while some people call boundaries, I call frame, because we're talking specifically about one-on-one healing work. Whereas boundaries can be related to any interpersonal relationship. So how we understand the frame and how we relate to the frame of our work is really important. Having a strong frame allows the work to go softer and deeper, because your clients are going to trust you more. Having a really strong frame is important. So what do I mean by strong frame? Well, let's talk about just the operations part of the business. Having a way of collecting payment that feels very intuitive and easy for the client is important. That is how they know that you're taking your business seriously. And if you take your business seriously, you're taking them seriously. Again, a strong frame. Scheduling, how they schedule with you matters. If it doesn't matter how you do it, whether you commit to a certain time every week or every other week, or you have a scheduler. I mean, I use a variation of all of these depending on my clients, but having an easy way for your clients to book appointments with you that feel intuitive is very important. So that's just in the operations standpoint of the frame. And then we're talking about the actual frame, the work, showing up on time, starting the sessions on time and ending on time is a really critical part of the frame. If you notice that with certain clients, you tend to go over the time, that's information. That's probably saying that there's something going on in the dynamic. Whether it's something going on with you, like you're wanting to people please, or it's something that's happening in the relationship, where you're playing out something about their world where they, may have been modeled weak frame as a child. Or weak boundaries as a child, I should say. So frame, in this way is really useful, because then when anything moves out of the frame, when anything happens that's outside the frame, if the frame changes, that can be information of inquiry. So if you have these very consistent systems for all of your clients, but there's one client that does things differently, that's information about why that client does it differently. And what about you did that client elicit that allows you to do things differently with that particular client? Starting sessions on time, ending things on time, it creates a corrective experience where they can trust that you will be the strong, securely attached caregiver in the relationship. Now, obviously, you're not the caregiver. You are a coach. You are a healer. We know that on a conscious level, but unconsciously, there is a power dynamic. I think I talked about this in part 2 or maybe part 1. There's a power dynamic intrinsic in the relationship, and how we relate to power dynamics tend to be how we relate to our predominant caregivers as a child. So there is a lot of space for healing here simply by being very, very strong in how you hold the frame. That means if you have a cancellation policy, if you have a late, like if a client is late to session, if a client cancels last minute, what are your policies that you have in place, and make sure you are adhering to those policies. So if you have a 24-hour cancellation policy and they cancel within 22 hours, then you know what you need to do. That is an important frame. That is clear expectations that you communicated with them, hopefully, ideally, at the beginning of your work together, and therefore are now going to adhere to. This is important, but the reason why this can be so hard is that we often feel like we're the bad guy, right? Like if they cancel within the window and it goes against our policy, charging them for that missed session or however way we do it, not rescheduling if you do, let's say, like a monthly charge rate, not rescheduling because they don't get to reschedule if they cancel within that time frame. Yeah, it can be very confronting. It can bring up a lot of our own stuff about conflict. It can bring up stuff about our own tendencies to people please. It can bring up our own stuff about our worthiness and whether we feel worthy of this. And that is so valid, and that's something for you to process. Because this is really informative for you and helpful for you to process so that you can be a stronger frame holder for your clients. Now, once you do that work, I call this dual processing. We do our own work and then we do the work with the client. So the first part is you do your own inquiry about what it brings up for you. And then once you have that out of the way, you can really hold space to what was coming up for the client. Maybe the client has a propensity to run late. And then, of course, that means that client is probably going to run late with you. That's information. That is now something that you two can address in the session and really talk about that dynamic. Because there usually isn't a place in the rest of their lives where they get to really talk about a dynamic without being attacked, right? Because we're not attacking that person. We're not saying you're wrong for being late. We're just saying, listen, I noticed that you were late to our session last week and I would love to talk about it. On the one hand, I totally get that this came up, that your daughter was late or blah, 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 that this happened. I totally get that. So let's name that and let's put that to the side. Let's just tuck it away here. And now we have space to explore what else could have been happening. What else could have been happening? That's one of my favorite techniques because it's very hard for people to really hold the both and. It's really hard for them to recognize that they could both have had conscious intentions and unconscious intentions, right? And we're doing depth work here, so we're trying to get into the unconscious. And so, in the session, they may be really caught up in the justification for why they were late. Like, oh yeah, well, my husband and, this happened and this happened. And that we're not saying that that's not valid. We're saying that is valid. And can we put that aside and explore what else could be here? It can be particularly helpful when we have a client who's really defensive and feels very much in their logical brain and has a hard time really tapping into their emotions, or have a hard time tapping into like a lot of complex emotions. So we can say, yeah, I hear that you feel really grateful for this experience, because that's where a lot of our clients are going to go, right? They're going to be grateful. I hear that you're really grateful that you learned a lot from this experience. So let's put that gratitude over here for a minute. Like, we'll pick it back up in a minute. I wonder what other feelings may you be experiencing other than gratitude. What I like about that is that we're not denying the gratitude. We're not saying that that's wrong or bad. We're not saying that they shouldn't feel gratitude. We're just saying, yes, I love that that's your experience. Let's name that. Let's put that here. And then let's see what else is here. What else may have room to explore when we put this over here? So that's one of my favorite techniques that I love to use. It's very simple, very effective, and it gives people, it teaches people that they can be having more than one experience at any given moment, that they could have been late because life happens, and that also they don't really respect their own time because of their own people-pleasing qualities. And that can be really fruitful to explore in a session. I mean, isn't that the whole point of this work, right? To get underneath the surface. Because if we're just tending to what's on the surface, we're not going to get to any lasting changes, because surface stuff can be easily changed. This is my big thing about mindset that I have so many issues with. And I talk so abundantly about how much I have issues with mindset, is that mindset is such a shallow shift. And while there is definitively a time and place for this type of shallow shifts, the lasting shifts that we want are going to come from the unconscious. They're going to come from a deeper awareness and a deeper insight into our behavior that goes beyond just trying to change our minds about something. And that's why I'm not a big fan of CBT, but that's another topic for another day. Okay, so frame. So those are just some of the examples of frame. Frame is the first and foremost thing that I talk about in my supervision, and I will talk about in my mentorship, because if the frame is wacky, it's hard to get to any other deeper work. If there's an inconsistency, if there's continual lateness, if there is payments that's not, being, like, whatever the issue is, if it's not addressed, nothing else, we can't really go much further. We have to talk about this. Now, the cool thing is that many of us as coaches, we have pretty clear boundaries in that we have a contract that outlines things pretty head on, right? So that we don't have to surprise somebody. We don't have to say, we never talked about this before, but this is important, right? That's the good news. It's all right there. And so they know that that's what is the frame. They know that that's the frame, but unconsciously they're playing something out with you by not respecting that frame. And now that gets to be a tremendous exploration. I know that I talked about this in part 1. It's very easy for us to look at this as an attack of self, right? They are disrespecting us. They're not respecting the work. This is personal. But honestly, it has so little to do with that. And it often has so much more to do with their own relationship dynamics as a child. And we miss out on opportunity to explore that if we're so caught up in taking it really personal. So again, that's a dual process. Of the one hand, let's process how it felt for you, for this client to have been late. And now that we got that out of the way, we can talk about what is happening in the relationship and what is happening with the client that is that may be playing out in the coaching relationship, and how can we name it and tend to it so that something really profound can happen and some shifts that the client has been wanting can happen. Okay, so let me think if there's anything else more that I want to talk about frame. Coaching, because it's an unregulated field, there tends to be very loose frames in terms of, so in the world of psychotherapy, you're not allowed to have dual relationships with your clients. So I can't be a friend of somebody and then have them be a psychotherapy client. And, that, for some argue that that's really an essential part of being able to do psychotherapy, is to not have dual relationships. And so it's not that you can't have it. Let me clarify. It's not that you can't have it. It's that it's ethically frowned upon, and it's reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But for example, you can't sleep with your clients, right? You can't have an intimate relationship with your therapy clients. That's against the law. That goes against laws. But then there's kind of like if you live in a small town and one of your clients is serves you at a restaurant, that's not breaking the law, but there's some things that you have to be thinking of in terms of confidentiality and addressing them, and then talking about that in session. So dual relationships is something that's very tricky in the world of psychotherapy, because in the world of psychotherapy, they believe that you can't really have dual relationships to maintain the integrity of the therapy. And so you can't be friends with your clients after you work together, after the therapy relationship is terminated. You can't have a relationship with them for a minimum of 2 years. And even then, it's typically frowned upon. Again, because of the power dynamic inherent structure of the therapy world. I think that in some ways this is problematic, because I think it forces us in some ways to compartmentalize something that's very difficult to compartmentalize. And on the other hand, I really get it. So in the world of coaching, there really isn't this. You can be best friends, and then they can hire you as a coach. And then, there's a real ease in which we can move from coach to friend to mentor to, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to put any laws around this. Like it's case by case basis, but I do think that we have to be very, very mindful of the relationship and whether the relationship can really sustain itself with the shift in the dynamics. Because when you go from being a friend to now being a coach and being privy to some of that person's really deep, intimate stuff, and they aren't privy to yours as much because the coaching work isn't about you, it's about the client. And so, you need to be mindful about how much space you take up in the session and how much you disclose. It then becomes a little bit unequal, and that's important to explore and investigate. So I'm not saying necessarily that you can't have dual relationships or that you shouldn't be a coach to a friend. The way I have my own ethical kind of guidelines that I go by, for the most part, I don't go with friends or people that I know intimately. I actually have a very good, I feel like I do a very good job of not being a coach when I'm in public, like social situations. I really know how to turn off that coach mode. I know how to turn off the therapy mode, and I can really just be human with people and not be wearing that hat. And so so I have like very clear boundaries in that way. And most of my friends don't ask me to be their coach because I don't really want that. I don't really find that that's the best shift in relationship that I'm interested in. Again, of course, there are exceptions. And then the same on the flip side. I'm very thoughtful of the relationship after the relationship has terminated, about whether or not we can shift into friend mode or not. It really depends on the work that we did. It really depends on the person. Again, it's case by case basis, but I'm extremely thoughtful about it. I think things through because it's really important for me to be in integrity with my work. And this is how I do that. Having that type of frame is really important for me. So you get to decide what relationships you want to have. Maybe for you that doesn't seem to be as much of a problem. That's totally good, totally okay. But I want you at least to start thinking about it. So much of what I offer in my mentorship is just being more thoughtful about the complexity of the interpersonal dynamics. We often think about things from a very narrow lens, and we miss out on really understanding people and understanding their psyche by not thinking things through. So that's just me. I tend to think things through. Again, every relationship is different and it can be complicated. Talking about it helps. Talking about the transition, talking about the ending of a relationship. I've had, conversations about what that's like to have the coaching relationship be done, and what is that going to feel like for the client when they see me on social media, and are they going to want to reach out? Like, what is that going to look like? What is that going to feel like? Usually that brings up so much good stuff about their desire to the desire to be close to their caregivers. There's just so much here. Okay. Having gone through all that, let's talk about trauma. One of the things that I see coaches market that's, I think, problematic is this idea that the deeper is better. That, the goal of coaching is to get fast results, and that is a differentiator between therapy, which tends to be more long-term. At least that's a shallow perspective, because I know it gets more complicated than that. But a lot of people's coaching's approach is, let me offer you transformation in like a few months, right? And so in order to offer that transformation in a few months, you have to go deep. You have to go really deep. I mean, that's the only way you're going to offer that transformation. Because if you're doing shallow work, like I talked about, it's not going to lead to any lasting changes. And so I see a lot of depth coaches do this, and it's so harmful, because just because the person thinks that they're ready to go deep doesn't mean that they are actually ready to go deep. In order for somebody to go deep into themselves and hold the pain that they've been avoiding for the majority of their lives, they need to have a pretty strong ego structure and secure attachment. They have to have a secure attachment to you, a sense of trust, and they have to have an ego structure where they can do the work without self-annihilation. So what do I mean by ego structure? Well, they have to have a pretty grounded sense of self. If they don't, and you take them deep, it can create severe mental illnesses, psychosis. It can lead to spiraling of coping skills and coping mechanisms, harmful mechanisms that they've used in the past. It can lead to regression in a way that's uncontainable. It can lead to really bad shit. So even though they're coming to you and they're saying, I want to go deep, most people don't even know what that means. They don't know what they really want because they don't know what that work really entails. I mean, even I don't at times really know what that entails when I say that I want to go deep with my therapist, right? So we have to be really, really intentional about where we take our clients. I have a client that I've been working with for over a year, and we're still navigating whether or not she can trust that she can go in a very deep, vulnerable place with me, without the relationship ending, right? I am having that in my own work with my therapist, where I'm hyper aware that I want to go, to really vulnerable places, and I'm terrified that I'm going to blow up the relationship the way I've blown up previous relationships. This is all grist for the mill. This is all stuff we get to work with. If we miss this shit, to try to focus on the end result of some sort of transformation, then we're missing the whole goddamn point of coaching. Going too deep, too fast is literally not the answer. We have to see the person and how they're integrating the material, and then we go off of their pace. The client sets the pace. Or else you run the risk of causing harm. This is where trauma comes in. Again, I talk about trauma because it's important that we're aware of how trauma plays out. I'm not saying that as a depth coach, you have to deal with trauma. In that, I don't often think, especially because most of us coaches don't have any type of formal experience, education with trauma. It's not enough to read a few books to do trauma work. It's not enough to have been coached or healed in your own trauma work to do trauma work for other people. It's not. Trauma is a complicated mechanism. Our own experience is not enough. Our own experience can be supportive and it can be helpful, but it's not enough. So I'm not saying that you have to do trauma work if you're a depth coach. But we have to be aware of it. We have to be informed by it. We have to know how it plays out in our clients so that we can then know if we need to refer them out, if they need to be doing a different type of work, or if they need to be doing coaching work and therapy work together, right? Because being trauma informed lets us understand and know when trauma is coming up. Most people in this world have experienced trauma to some degree. Most people in this world, that's what it means, I think, to be human, is to have experienced difficult human experiences, human relationships. Trauma is just a part of this world. So when we're saying we're trauma informed, we're saying that we understand how this very important aspect of the human brain is playing out with our clients. There's so many different types of trauma, right? There's intergenerational trauma that we carry in our bones. There's racial trauma. I mean, the ways in which trauma affect humans is a lot. And that's why when we're working with our clients, it's important for us to know how trauma may be playing out for them, so that we can then decide how we want to use that information. I like to think of being trauma informed not as a destination. Like once I pass this test, once I do this certification program, I am trauma informed. I know that that's the title. I know that that's what we use. I know I use that title. I'm just saying that like when I think of trauma informed, I don't think of it as a destination, but rather like an attunement, a day-to-day recognition of the ways that trauma may be impacting my clients. This is important because the minute we get cocky and we think that we know how trauma is going to show up for somebody, we miss something. We miss getting curious. So you may ask, well, first, like, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Well, there's actually no one definition of this, but usually a person or a program or a system that is trauma informed or offers trauma informed care encapsulates a few things. First, they realize what trauma is. They understand the potential impact of trauma, and they understand how widespread it is, right? How pervasive trauma is. That's important. Other thing that is part of trauma-informed approach is that they can recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in their clients. This is important. We have to know what trauma looks like in our clients in order to know whether or not we're going to move towards that trauma or move away from that trauma. Maybe we move towards that trauma by slowly bringing them a little bit closer to the point where we're no longer able to take them further, or we move them away from trauma and help them build systems to support themselves when that trauma response is coming up, right? But we have to know the signs and symptoms of trauma. Okay, the other kind of important facet of being trauma-informed is to be able to integrate the knowledge that you have on trauma into your practices, into your procedures, into your policies. That means your entire business has to be trauma-informed, consent-driven. One of the ways that my business was not consent-driven, and I was mortified to discover this, but I had set up a system and I didn't even think about it, and then I forgot that I had set up that system. But anytime a guest on my podcast would sign up for my podcast, like as a guest, they would get automatically added to my email list. And I don't know what I was thinking when I set that up, but once I realized that was happening, I was mortified because I respect my guests and I respect their consent, and they didn't consent to sign up to my email list. That was not trauma informed. And so I sent a mass email to all of my guests apologizing profusely and letting them know that I was going to delete them from my list unless they specified otherwise. So to be trauma-informed doesn't mean to just know how to be trauma-informed in the session, but it also means having a whole business that it takes people's trauma into consideration. And then, of course, the final kind of aspect of trauma-informed care or a trauma-informed approach is that you are actively seeking to avoid re-traumatization. We want to avoid further traumatizing our clients. Now, that may seem like a given, but you will be amazed at how many clients come to me saying that they've worked with a coach that further traumatized them, that told them it was their fault, that told them that they just had to think more positively, that told them that they were being victims. And that is not okay. That is not okay. So I honestly believe that every coach needs to be trauma-informed. I don't care if you're a business coach, if you're a health coach, if you're a life coach. Trauma is showing up because we are traumatized humans. All of us have some level, some way of having trauma in our bodies. Therefore, we all need to be informed of how trauma may play out so that we can take greater action and decide from a fullness of what to do with that client. Again, not saying that all coaches have to do trauma work. Of course not. That really depends on your experience. That depends on your support system. That depends on your education. I am just saying that it is really important for all of us to be trauma informed. Now, I want to name that there's trauma and then there's complex trauma, right? Trauma tends to be characterized as an acute experience that the human was unable to integrate, unable to internalize due to lack of support systems, due to risk factors, due to the event itself. whereas complex trauma tends to be chronic. So smaller or, significant, but consistent events, again, that the individual has had a hard time integrating. So complex trauma tends to fall in the world of, let's say, continual neglect or feeling like misattuned by your caregivers. Trauma is both in the something happening and also can be something not happening. So lack of emotional attunement from caretakers, 100% gets to be chronic trauma because it wasn't just a one-time event. It just happened continually throughout their childhood. I actually have a whole podcast episode on what is trauma. It's episode 83. You can go to the show notes, and I have a link there for you. So you can kind of get more of my gist of trauma. But it's important to distinguish this because, it's easier as coaches for us to recognize acute trauma and to refer out, or at least to not go in that area, right? So if a client says that they experienced a severe car accident and now they're having a hard time sleeping, we may deal with maybe some of the outer edges of that, like the sleeping, or, and trying to offer some other type of mindfulness, et cetera, depending on the client, but not maybe get to the actual trauma of that car accident. Acute trauma is really, really difficult to separate the individual from, because acute trauma tends to lead to a whole personality change, personality shift, because personality is really just where the individual meets the environment. So much of personality is actually based on how we were responded to and how our environment affected us, and less on like something that we were born with. And so complex trauma tends to affect us on a very deep level. It shapes how we see the world, it shapes who we are, and it lives within every thought that we have, right? So when we're doing coaching work with someone who has experienced complex trauma, it's much, much harder to separate our coaching work with the trauma. Odds are it's showing up in the coaching work, and that's where we have to be really careful, and that's where we have to be trauma informed. That's where I think we really have to recognize when we're going in way too over our heads. And one of the things that I mentioned, I believe in part 1, is that the body really gives us a lot of information. And so, the way that we can ease our clients into this is by really noticing and recognizing how they feel in their body and how much they are able to tune into how they feel in their bodies. If they're very disconnected from their bodies, and have used that kind of like dissociative state, we have to tread very, very carefully, because odds are there's a lot of integration work to be done, and you may be the person to do it or you may not, but we have to tread more carefully than someone who can really get into their body. There's so many subtle ways that trauma shows up in one-on-one client work. For example, we also have to be thinking about, this is again a little bit of dual processing, is like, how would we have responded to that scenario? So if your client's mother abandoned her when she was 7, and she acts as if it's not a big deal, and she acts that it didn't really affect her, you gotta just ask yourself, like, how would I have been affected by that? Or an average human, how would an average human be affected by that? And its odds are, that an average human would really be affected by that. That would be a very traumatizing experience, and probably left a huge scar of abandonment. And so now that client is telling that they didn't really think much about it, well, now it's like, oh, so they're using minimization. They're trying to really minimize the impact of that event, so much so that they've convinced themselves that they don't even have an issue. And so we have to tread carefully, because once we start opening that up, that actually was trauma, oh my God, that's going to now force them to confront also the pain of being left and the abandonment wound that is left behind, probably worthiness wound there also. So much of my work, actually, both in Worthy Women Rise and in my one-on-one work, has been in supporting my clients get to a point where they can recognize that what they happened was traumatic. A lot of times people don't see themselves as victims. They don't see themselves as having experienced trauma. And so because of that, they can't heal it. They can't integrate the fact that they did experience trauma. So once you get to the point where they understand that it's trauma, then you can decide maybe they need to be referred to a trauma expert or an expert at that topic. The more choices open up at that point. Most of my clients who have said that they have been harmed by a coach is because the coach invalidated their lived experience. And so it's really important that we just develop a sensitivity to how people show up in the room. And again, this is everything I'll be covering in my mentorship. But particularly when we have complex trauma, complex trauma tells us that how we've been treated is acceptable. And it leads to us tending to think that we need that there's something wrong with us, right? And that we need to be fixed. It needs to be fast in order for us to be okay. Again, deeper and faster is not always better. In fact, it's rarely better. Things take time. Relationships take time. And we want to be really just mindful that we're not participating in the exact pattern that our clients have in their lives where they take things faster than they can integrate them. I have had clients who, when we're talking about something really hard, they'll say, "Oh, this feels really weird," or that was strange when someone did something that really hurt them. Again, language is important, and that tells me that they're just slowly taking what am I trying to say? That they're not quite integrated, that there's still a lot of dissociation and there's some work to do there. And again, slow and trusting the timing and being in conversation about the timing of the work is really, really important. Everything that I'm sharing here is what it means to be a responsible coach, what it means to be really holding people's psyche with a lot of love and care. Anyone who is doing any type of depth work needs to be in their own supervision, period, end of story. I'm noticing a lot in launching this mentorship that the response is, "Oh my gosh, this is so important, but for everybody else. Like, this isn't for me." And it's really important to ground and actually, yes, it is. It is for you. It is for all of you. It is for all of us. It is for me too. We don't know what we don't know. And if we're not getting support, if we don't have a space where we can talk about how our one-on-one coaching clients are what they're bringing in, how they're bringing it up, what their interpersonal challenges is, what the patterns are, if we don't have that space, then we're missing out on doing this work responsibly. Again, I deeply believe that this offering is going to revolutionize the coaching industry, and I'm really, really excited. I don't want to be the first or last person to offer this. I think that as we start to understand the importance of this, more and more people are going to offer this. So that's really exciting. Supervision needs to be a staple in the coaching industry for depth coaching. And so this is my way of making a positive impact in the coaching industry. So I hope that this series has been helpful for you. I'll probably be doing more conversations about how to be a depth coach, because this is an expertise of mine. I've been doing extensive training on it. I just signed up for a really intense training program starting in October, where it's going to go even, I'm just so excited. And yeah, so we're going to be navigating this journey together, and it's an honor to be here with you all, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.